Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Calgary Institute for the Humanities' 7th Annual LGBTQ2S Lecture. Right on. I have to say it is wonderful to make it to our 7th year. My name is Jim Ellis, and I'm the director of the Calgary Institute for the Humanities at the University of Calgary. And I would like to start by acknowledging that we are gathering on the traditional lands of the peoples of Treaty 7, very near to their traditional gathering place at the confluence of the Bow and the Elbow Rivers, a site traditionally known as Mohkinstsis to the Blackfoot, Wichispa to the Stoney Nakoda, and Gusitsi to the Tsuut'ina. The peoples of Treaty 7 include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Pigunni, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, the Bearspaw, and the Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. And tonight we particularly acknowledge and salute the Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer members of these communities, past, present, and future. At the Institute, we're very proud that this lecture has made it to our 7th year, and so I would like to begin by thanking some of the people and organizations that have made tonight's lecture possible. At this point, I was actually going to introduce Dean Aoife McNamara, who's the Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Calgary, which is our home, who was going to say a few words. Unfortunately, she has a sick dog at home. But we're very grateful to Dr. McNamara and to the faculty and to the university, of course, for the support of the Institute and of this lecture and event. But I would also like to thank UC Advancement, Alumni, and Development, both at the university and at the Faculty of Arts, who have been supportive of the lecture series throughout. And at Alumni, particularly Ben Fleury, who you may have met at the door, who's been working with us since the very beginning. And alumni are one of the presenters of tonight's event. Thanks also to John McBurney and all of the team here at the Calgary Public Library, who are also one of tonight's presenters. This building and the public library system are the city's crown jewels, and we're very happy to be here once again in this gorgeous space. Thanks to Gary Creevy, Registrar Emeritus of the university, who's been a source of advice and support from the beginning. And a big thanks to Al Austin and the Austin Victor Fund at the Calgary Foundation, who have provided substantial financial support, and to all of the donors who have helped make this lecture possible. So with this lecture, we continue the University of Calgary's proud tradition of supporting the LGBTQ2S+ community in Calgary. The Institute is Canada's oldest humanities institute, in fact, founded at the university in 1976 to provide a bridge from the university to the community for events such as this. The lecture series started with 2 talks by truly groundbreaking queer scholars. The groundbreaking historian George Chauncey, author of Gay New York, and then Lillian Faderman, author of Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, and many other crucial works of queer history. Subsequent lectures have included an online salon with 3 young Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer artist activists, Billy Ray Belcourt, our own Josh Whitehead, and Shawnee Kish. We've had the brilliant trans scholar Jules Gill-Peterson, who talked about the colonial roots of transphobia. The chair of film and television at UCLA, Amy Villarejo, gave us an overview of contemporary international queer cinema. And then just last year, Professor Dan Healy of Oxford gave us an account of the role of homophobia in Russia's assault on Ukraine, sadly still current events. Now, as with Professor Gill-Peterson's lecture on the history of trans oppression, tonight's talk is very timely, unfortunately, in the Alberta context. I'm sure you are all aware of the Alberta government's sudden interest in the content of school libraries, and particularly a group of graphic novels that happen to feature queer themes. These same award-winning graphic novels, which for the most part sensitively portray the lives of queer youth, have been the target of a number of US-based right-wing parental rights groups. And the role of these groups on the Alberta government has been well documented by journalists, including just today in the Guardian newspaper. The Guardian notes that two of these internet-based so-called parents' rights groups have taken credit for the Alberta government's decision and have celebrated their role in banning these books. These groups are Action for I shouldn't be naming them, Action for Canada and Parents for Choice in Education. And Parents for Choice actually supplied the list of books for the Alberta government to have a look at. The Guardian reported this morning that Alberta's Education Minister, Dimitrios Nicolaides, and other provincial officials have insisted they are not looking to erase queer stories from school shelves. But of course, Action for Canada and Parents for Choice openly express disdain for the LGBTQ community. If you would like to learn more about the parental rights movement here in Alberta, the Parkland Institute will be holding a webinar just next week, Thursday, September the 4th, and issuing a report entitled Parental Rights, Who's Driving Alberta's Education Agenda? So I'd encourage you to tune into that and to access the report if you can. It's significant, I think, that the Education Minister has publicly said he hasn't actually read the books in question. Ponder that for a moment. The Education Minister is banning books, and he says he's too busy to read a graphic novel, which, let's face it, is mostly pictures. I'm happy to say that these books, which our government has labeled pornographic, will be on sale after the lecture. Yeah, exactly. Just in case you, unlike Minister Nicolaides, actually want to read them before making up your mind as to whether they're appropriate to include in school libraries. And I want to especially thank Shelf Life Books, I hope they can hear me back there, for being here tonight and for supporting our freedom to read. Independent bookstores and libraries have been crucial in the bulwarks for freedom. So it was with this situation in mind that we were very delighted that Professor Kenneth Kidd accepted our invitation to give tonight's lecture. Professor Kidd, as you'll hear, is an international authority on queer youth literature, and it so happens that one of his collaborators, Dr. Derek Mason, is a colleague of mine in the Department of English at the university. Derek is the author of Queer Anxieties of Young Adult Literature and Culture, and he's the co-editor with Kenneth Kidd of Alt Kid Lit, What Children's Literature Might Be, and Queer as Camp, Essays on Summer, Style, and Sexuality. And so at this point, I'd like to invite Derek up to properly introduce Kenneth Kidd. Derek.
Thanks so much, Jim. So it's a real honor and pleasure to be here tonight to introduce my friend, colleague, and collaborator, Dr. Kenneth Kidd. Dr. Kidd joins us from the University of Florida, where he is professor in and chair of the Department of English. I'm tempted to introduce Kenneth as the father of the field of queer children's literature studies, but I won't, only because I'd much rather introduce him as the field's fairy godmother. Indeed, in 1998, Kenneth waved his magic wand and the pumpkin of children's literature exploded in a cloud of glitter, transmogrifying itself into a dragged-up, unicorn-drawn carriage that would carry the field into the rainbow-crowned horizon. In his introduction to a special issue of Children's Literature Association Quarterly entitled Lesbian and Gay Children, or Lesbian and, well, that's a completely different issue, Lesbian and Gay Literature for Children and Young Adults, Kenneth invited readers to consider the characters Rat and Mole from the children's classic The Wind in the Willows as engaging in, as he writes, a playful exploration of male homo economics. Children's literature studies would never be the same. Since then, Kenneth has gone on to publish 6 co-edited essay collections and 3 books, in addition to numerous scholarly articles and book chapters. His co-edited collections include, relevant to this talk, Over the Rainbow, Queer Children's and Young Adult Literature, published in 2011, a book that I read so often as a graduate student that its pages became detached from its spine. He has also published on topics including literary prizing, environmentalism, and archival studies, and I've had the privilege of collaborating with Kenneth on 2 of these collections that Jim mentioned, Queer as Camp, an investigation of the many queernesses of summer camp and camp aesthetics, published in 2019, and released just last year, Alt Kid Lit, which both proposes and problematizes the idea of an alternative canon of children's literature. Kenneth's 3 books have had equally transformative impacts on how we read, think about, and teach children's and young adult literature. Making American Boys, published in 2004, explores literary and cultural programs of boyology in relation to stories of boys raised by various animals. In 2011's Freud in Oz, Kenneth probes the intersections of children's literature and psychoanalysis, considering everything from the unconscious dramas of Maurice Sendak's dreamscapes to the psychic interiority of the adolescent novel. Most recently, in 2020, Kenneth published Theory for Beginners, Children's Literature as Critical Thought, which interrogates children's literature's engagement with and presence inside theory and philosophy. With Elizabeth Marshall, he also edits the Children's Literature and Culture series at Routledge Press. Kenneth is an active leader, former two-time president, and award-winning mentor with the Children's Literature Association, truly one of the most generous mentors I've met in my career, I might add, whose guidance and support has benefited the lives of so many younger and not so younger anymore scholars, myself included. Tonight, Kenneth's talk draws in part on work that will appear in his fourth book, which looks specifically at Florida children's literature. In the context of rapidly intensifying homo and transphobia here in Alberta, in the US and beyond, Kenneth's work, which asks us to consider how children's literature is in many ways fundamentally and unavoidably queer, feels more urgent than ever. Please join me in welcoming this brilliant scholar, generous mentor, and wonderful friend, my fairy godmother and yours, Dr. Kenneth Kidd.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? It's wonderful to see everyone here. I'm just relieved that I didn't actually start crying when you were giving that beautiful introduction, but thank you so much. It is a joy to be here with you in this beautiful city and a beautiful space, and to see your beautiful faces. And the two books I did with Darrett that we co-edited together, one of them is Queer as Camp, and today I went to Campland, the story, and I see a couple of people who have camp shirts, queer camp shirts, and that was magical. And I'm staying at the Alt Hotel, so it seems like fate to me. All right. And obviously, I want to thank the Institute and the Public Library. I think it's extremely appropriate for us to be here in the Public Library. And of course, Dr. Mason, Dr. Ellis, Dr. Wilkinson, everyone who played a role in this tonight's event, and all of you for being here. So I appreciate your patience. I should say first, I'm most definitely not an expert on censorship or book bans. I know we have a lot of expertise in the audience, so I am looking forward to questions and corrections and follow-ups, and hopefully a little conversation around some of these issues, which are obviously very difficult. So obviously, when Dr. Ellis invited me to join you today, the invitation was motivated in part by news that I think began in May 2025, that Alberta's government wants to establish new requirements for school libraries, and specifically to prohibit books that the province deems age inappropriate. Right? That's one of the key phrases we hear over and over, due to sexually explicit content, another key phrase, neither of which has any clear definition or content. Apparently, this process is fast underway, as we've been hearing, with a new ministerial order requiring school boards to review book catalogs and collections and to adopt those age-appropriate standards and content policies. And at first I heard it was by 2026, and now I'm hearing an October 1 deadline for the first stage in that process. So I defer to you who knows more about this. All right, so this is the slide, right? So I come to you from the land of Mordor, also known as the US state of Florida, where similar restrictions on free speech and free reading have been in place now for several years. And as it happens, the proposed school library standards in Alberta are openly modeled on those in Florida, as many of you know. And the tactic of challenging books around this idea of age appropriateness is inspired by Florida's strategy. And Florida's not the only one to have pursued that strategy, but it's certainly practiced it with a certain focus, intensity, and hostility. Both Florida and Alberta have also rolled back the rights of trans and non-binary youth, and both prevent discussions of gender and sexuality in K-12 public education. In Alberta, as in Florida, conservative forces are mounting a broad-scale campaign against queer people and freedom of expression, both. Florida has long been a bellwether for the United States, representing some of our best, if also some of our worst, national tendencies. As goes Florida, so goes America. And get a little sense of that from this. Unfortunately, for the last stretch of years, Florida has been a laboratory of reactionary and rather hateful policies across the board, a laboratory of anti-wokeness, to quote our governor, Ron DeSantis. Florida, Ron likes to say, is where woke goes to die. During President Biden's tenure, the American political dumpster fire seemed kind of contained to Florida and a handful of other states, notably Texas, which is my state of origin, so I really know how to pick them. But now the nation is burning, and so is the world, and the Trump administration fanning existing flames while happily starting new fires. Trump, you may remember, also calls Florida home and beat out DeSantis for the Republican presidential nomination. So an underwhelming conclusion here, if the US is awful right now, and it is, Florida is a special kind of awful. Awful in its pettiness as well as its inhumane policies. You may have heard, for example, and this is minor compared to, say, tanks rolling through the streets of DC and troopers being called to essentially evacuate homeless people. But you may have heard, for example, that recently the Florida Department of Transportation, acting from a directive from the Trump administration, ordered that all rainbow-colored pedestrian crosswalks be painted over in the ostensible interest of safety. Never mind that the DOT itself approved these crosswalks to begin with, and never mind that research shows that brightly colored sidewalks actually help prevent accidents, not cause them. My town of Gainesville was forced to paint over its beautiful rainbow crosswalks about 5 days ago, or be denied all state funding for roads and transportation. It's a substantial amount of money. So all these towns in Florida are faced with this and are making different decisions, most of them capitulating to this. Same situation in St. Petersburg, which is another fairly liberal and queer-friendly town. Most brutally, though, and this made the global news, just last week, the rainbow crosswalks outside the Pulse nightclub memorial were painted over in the dead of night by the Florida DOT, not even during the day. Pulse nightclub, of course, was a gay bar on the site of a brutal homophobia-driven mass shooting in 2016. 49 people died, 53 more were injured. The people of Orlando pushed back when this happened, with the mayor, Buddy Dyer, rightly calling the secretive overnight cover-up a cruel political act, and with many, many others denouncing the move. So there's no shortage of criticism, including from many elected public officials. Again, just to repeat, the rainbow crosswalk was painted over by the state in the dead of night, steps outside a queer bar turned memorial where 49 people were murdered. So there's no denying the symbolic violence here, right? They're erasing not only a pride, but a public memory and accountability. In my view, this makes both the federal and the state government complicit in the murder of queer citizens, many of whom were also Black, Indigenous, people of color. And of course, the US federal government is catching up with Florida in the atrocity competition, ICE raids, arrests, deportations, halting of funding for scientific and medical research, including research on children with cancer, the federal defunding of public radio and television, cancellation of anything cultural, and especially anything about identity or community, the dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and in fact, the entire Department of Education. The censorship not only of individual works of art, but of whole institutions, right? The Smithsonian Museum, I'm sure some of you have been following that conversation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and on and on. And while the judiciary has offered some check on the Trump administration, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court has given Trump, as we know, extraordinary power and endorsed his dismantling, essentially, of the public sphere. Closer to our topic tonight of book bans and anti-queer censorship, in June 2025, so just a couple of months ago, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of parents challenging a Maryland County Board of Education's introduction of LGBTQ+ inclusive materials in the curriculum, basically allowing parents to opt their children out of those materials based on religious objections. That decision, in the case was Mahmoud versus Taylor, essentially grants parents veto power over public school curriculum. In her dissent, liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor rules that the ruling, quote, strikes at the core premise of public schools, public education, that children may come together to learn not the teachings of a particular faith, but a range of concepts and views that reflect our entire society, end quote. So the situation in the US and especially in Florida may or may not be instructive for you here in Alberta, who are obviously trying to respond to the fast shifting scene. We know, for example, that the Alberta government drew specifically on banned books lists in the US to help identify inappropriate materials in Canadian institutions. and these are, again, books ostensibly harmful to minors, they had to resort to such lists because, of course, as Jim mentioned, the people in power don't know the books and don't bother to read them, right? I mean, this is painfully obvious. And this is the kind of harmful to minors language in the US legal system is very similar in the Canada context, but this is kind of a sort of a quick just gloss on that idea and the what harmful to minors laws try to do or claim. And in fact, I think even the trickier thing is the Alberta government even used an anti-censorship article by PEN America to help identify those problematic titles. So even the criticism of the censorship is being weaponized, right, in turn. So it's a risk, right, of public discourse. Still, censorship efforts are at an earlier stage here and might be halted or at least slowed down. And of course, the overall national as well as provincial context is different. Much, I think, will obviously depend on execution and enforcement and pushback on the ground in the schools and the libraries and communities. So I'm going to say a little more first about the new Florida restrictions, again, in the context of a little bit of Florida history, not too much, I promise, in the hopes that some of the details might be illuminating for sort of resistance planning. And then after that, I'm going to turn to the slightly more encouraging topic of queer advocacy and anti-censorship work in libraries and also in what I'm calling Florida Kid Lit. The new restrictions on free speech and reading in Florida go way beyond book banning, right? And I think that's already true here as well, and target queer and BIPOC people themselves, young people included, in fact, maybe young people especially. The first and most infamous recently passed law, Florida law, is the first one above here, the Parental Rights and Education Law. That sounds like a very, very positive thing, doesn't it? Parental rights, who doesn't believe in that? This was nicknamed Don't Say Gay, as it forbids any discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity in the public schools for students in kindergarten through 3rd grade, while also limiting such discussion for older students. And this is the catch. Don't Say Gay doesn't just prevent classroom discussions of sexuality and gender, much less any print or media materials about those topics. It disallows any acknowledgement of queer people or families. Never mind acknowledgement that some children might themselves identify as other than heterosexual, cisgender. It's a gag order, basically. The law protects the rights of only some parents, obviously, and meanwhile intensifies the risk of stigma and discrimination in and beyond the classroom. So really already documented some documentation of an uptick in violence against some of these kids and harassment. Meanwhile, our governor and his staff took every opportunity to reinforce a long-standing homophobic conflation of queerness with child molestation, right? This is a very familiar script, likening discussions of sexuality to sexual grooming. And a number of people in the DeSantis state government made very explicit statements about this. It's all very public. Same old playbook, and the same one, I think, that's functioning here as well. So it's unfortunately, if not universal, it's very common in Anglophone Western culture, at least. In Florida, Don't Say Gay was followed quickly by 2 other laws known as Stop Woke, and that was the actual acronym for the law. And I don't talk about that one as much here, but it's essentially a kind of prohibition against critical race theory and against really teaching of African-American history in public schools is really a lot of what it's about. And the other one was the Curriculum Transparency Law, which is really the one that supports the censorship efforts. And that one requires that all books and media in public schools be pre-approved by state-certified media specialists with a group called Moms for Liberty controlling that process. So once again, the rhetoric is, of course, whose liberty is this exactly? This censorship measure was signed into law 5 months after an incident at an Orange County school board meeting. Orange County's, Orlando's in Orange County, so that's sort of central Florida. In that meeting, a member of the public read from Kababi's graphic memoir Genderqueer, copies of which are available for sale in the back, which includes descriptions of sex acts, but it's also about choosing not to have sex. If you read the book, it's actually it's a very thoughtful and careful reflection on these issues. The person who read the book at the meeting was removed from the meeting. Copies of the memoir were then pulled from schools in the district. And as some of you may know, a similar situation unfolded in Texas and then in other states around Mike Curado's Flamer, which is also a graphic narrative. And Jim mentioned the fact that so many of these are graphic narratives, and I think probably picks up on long-standing anxieties about comics and the seduction of the innocent and so forth, right? So it's not an accident. They're not the only books being challenged, but they are being especially challenged. So the curriculum transparency law, I'm pointing to it, it's not there anymore, but remember that one. The curriculum transparency law applies not only to the school library, but to any collection of books in a school, including teacher collections, just private collections in a classroom. This is what they look like now. Many schools require the removal of all materials until they can be vetted. And so essentially the difference here is that instead of saying, okay, these 10 titles are not appropriate, we must remove them, the policy now is everything's removed, and then you, one by one, admit things back in when the state board approves. So essentially everything's banned until it's not, which unfortunately is rare. The law also shifts decision-making away from teachers, and it doesn't just do that. Teachers can be convicted of a third-degree felony for violating this law. They can go to jail for this, right? The official communications from the DeSantis government present all of this as a really wonderful thing. So, this is a transparency bill. It requires transparency, provides parental review, in fact, parents can basically sue if they don't like the public school's decision, sets curriculum standards, protects those parents. Florida is the most parent-friendly state, unless you happen to be a queer parent or you disagree with this or you have any other kind of objection. So thanks to these laws, Florida is now the epicenter of book banning efforts in the United States, surpassing its closest competitor, Texas. Florida had the second highest number of book bans in the US already before this legislation. But in 2023, more books were targeted for removal from public or school libraries in Florida than in any other state. And according to data from the American Library Association, 2,700 titles were targeted for restriction or removal in that year in 2023, and that's 1,200 more than in Texas. Challenges and removals do vary by Florida county and school district, with the larger counties in South Florida, which is much more heavily populated, having far such challenges and removals than some of the smaller but more conservative rural Florida towns or counties of rural Florida. In 2022, for instance, not a single book was removed from Miami-Dade County, so Miami, in that area. Whereas some of the smaller districts, hundreds of titles were challenged. And it's not unusual for one person to challenge hundreds of titles. It happens all the time. Typically, of course, again, without reading them. Book bans, of course, have quickly proliferated in other states and beyond those national borders, with one commentator comparing the scene to a never-ending game of whack-a-mole, and noting that in 2024, a Florida school district actually banned a book called Ban This Book, because the book, protests book bans. You won't be surprised to hear that challenged books are disproportionately written by authors of color and or members of the queer community. The ALA reports that in 2023, books representing the voices and lived experiences of LGBTQIA and BIPOC individuals make up 47% of those targeted in censorship attempts, way beyond the percentage of those titles relative to the publishing scene, right, and the number of titles total. That's a huge percentage, especially considering how few books for kids and young adults are still being not just written, but published, right, by queer and diverse authors that go through the process. And so, the kind of politics of publishing is also, I think, in the mix here. If we look at PEN America's comprehensive list of book bans in Florida from 2021 to 2024, we notice dozens and dozens and dozens of queer titles. Also published are picture books about sex education, picture books with any kind of queer leading content, even just the very innocuous gay uncle sort of type books. And as well as, lots of books published for adult readers. And this is a kind of fuzzy slide. Oh, it's actually okay on this screen. But these are some of the titles that have been challenged and in some cases removed. And that PEN America list is, again, one of the lists that the Alberta government used to sort of say, well, what should we ban? Oh, great, we don't have to do all that work. It's been done for us. So why is Florida so terrible? Well, Florida's history is long, messy, and kind of depressing on balance. We need to remember that Florida was admitted to the Union in 1845 as a state allowing enslavement. And despite a population boom, diversifying demographics, and a brief period of political openness, Florida is now firmly red, Republican red, in political leadership and in state culture. And it's just super frustrating because Florida is the third most populous US state after California and Texas, and also one of the most diverse states in the US in terms of demographics, that just over 50% identify as white of the population. Significant Cuban American, but also Latinx population in general, significant Caribbean population. The recent homophobic laws are obviously anything but original. So just a quick backstory on some of this before we come back to some of the titles. If you're familiar with American political history, you likely know about 1950s McCarthyism, or the Second Red Scare, which was a national witch hunt, not only of known communists, but also gays and anyone perceived as left-leaning or free-thinking. Never to be outdone, Florida had its own homegrown version of McCarthyism, with the state-level Florida Legislative Investigative Committee, unofficially called the Johns Committee after its leader. The Johns Committee was set up in 1956 in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, which was the Supreme Court case that desegregated public education. The original purpose, and I think this is super interesting, the original purpose of the Johns Committee was to impede desegregation. That was the first goal, was stop desegregation. But after the NAACP thwarted that, the committee invented a new rationale for its existence, which was the purported spread of homosexuality in schools. For the next 7 years, the Johns Committee outed and expelled students and staff, driving not a few to suicide. At my institution, the University of Florida, 20 faculty were fired outright, at least 50 students were expelled. One of the students was lesbian novelist Rita Mae Brown, whose 1973 Ruby Fruit Jungle includes a fictionalized account of Brown's experience at the University of Florida. I don't know if anybody knows Ruby Fruit Jungle, but it's a classic of lesbian lit. It's a fun book. In that novel, Brown hilariously calls my hometown of Gainesville the bedpan of the South, telling she was actually expelled, according to records, not for homosexuality, but for race mixing, as she was involved with a civil rights group. Anti-queer activism did not end with the disbanding of this committee in the 1970s. Many of the practices just filtered into the State Department of Education's policies. And in the late 1970s, and some of you may know or have read about this, Florida-based singer Anita Bryant, who was also the spokeswoman for the Florida Citrus Commission, spearheaded a campaign called Save Our Children, of course. What else would it be called? Designed to repeal an anti-discrimination ordinance. As with Don't Say Gay, Save Our Children leaned on the same tired old fears, right? That gay people abuse children just de facto. And despite all of this, Floridians do say gay, have long acknowledged and embraced queer people, young queers included. Certain areas of Florida are especially queer-friendly and queer-dense. You may know some of them. Key West, for example, boasts a rich queer heritage known for its elaborate drag shows, and historians such as Julio Calpo Jr. and Jerry Watkins have documented the queer history of areas as different as Miami and the so-called Redneck Riviera, which is up in the north part of the state, the Panhandle or coastal region, stretching from Pensacola on the western edge down to Panama City. And Miami, by the way, was promoted actively by the state as Fairyland. There were big billboards that advertised it. Queer culture is actually well established in the Sunshine State with queer businesses, social organizations, community centers, and neighborhoods. Statewide equality for Florida, dedicated to LGBTQ+ protections and advocacy, has existed in some form since its founding in 1997. At the same time, both Calpo Jr. and Watkins, so the book on the left and on the right here, I'm sorry the image isn't that clear. But both of those scholars talk about how Florida's culture of tourism has a sort of push-pull relationship to queer culture and what's now called pink tourism, right? Tourism sort of targeting queer people. As Watkins observes, the policing of queer people in Florida is part of a larger effort to kind of demonstrate vigilance to potential tourists and migrants to assure the benefits of capitalist commerce. So it's basically all about money, tourism, commerce. The tensions over queer Florida play out in really weird ways, as with, for example, Governor DeSantis's recent and ongoing fights with the Walt Disney Company. Have any of you been following this? It's been pretty amusing. Disney vocally opposed, publicly opposed Don't Say Gay when it was a bill. And DeSantis, in turn, attacked Disney as anti-woke, which, was a really interesting turn because for many years the question was, Disney is clearly trying to cash in on queer, tourism. Like, should we let them? Is Gay Day good for us? And now it's like, yeah, it's great because Disney is like, fighting back against the governor. This fight continues, and DeSantis is trying to sort of strip Disney of its unique legal autonomy. That's a whole other conversation, but this fight continues. Disney, of course, is the most visited tourist site in the world, drawing between 50 and 60 million visitors annually. And so you'd think that the governor wouldn't mess with it. But DeSantis calculated, maybe rightly, that the political winds were shifting such that Florida's kind of rebranding as the free state and the anti-woke state would offset any tourism losses. And when you drive into Florida, should you have the misfortune, you will see a big "Welcome to Florida" billboard, and it says "Welcome to the free state of Florida." Freedom, of course, very selective. So that's the bad news for Mordor, especially my little peninsula of it. So what can be done? Where do we go from here? Well, this is one option. It's tempting sometimes. There are, of course, many fronts of resistance, including legal challenges, public organizing, professional noncompliance, and symbolic counterattacks, right? And plus parts of the new Florida laws have already been found unconstitutional. Both the state and federal governments expect that. Like, that's not a surprise to them. They're flagrantly unconstitutional. But the strategy is put them on the books anyway, wait for the legal challenges to come through. In the meantime, they have their impacts, right? But in any case, there is a legal pushback. It may not be the most strategic thing, and I recognize that California Governor Gavin Newsom is a complicated figure, but I have to say I'm enjoying his social media trolling of both Trump and DeSantis. And I don't know if you've seen any of these recent tweets, but he's kind of adopted the all caps and absurdity of Trump's tweets. So I'm getting a kick out of that. It's a thing of beauty. Even if it's not maybe the most strategic thing, it's hard to say. For those of us who believe in books and reading, especially books for kids, we can also help support and boost the anti-censorship work of librarians, and we can help support Writers for Kids. Even writers for kids in Florida who make space for queer representation and sometimes political commentary. In the United States, until about the 1920s, librarians understood their role as really protective and regulatory for the most part, but that started to shift by the late 30s. And at that point, librarians kind of shifted away from a professional ethic of essentially of censorship to a professional ethic of freedom, right? A freedom to read or unrestricted access to books. The US first Library Bill of Rights was adopted in 1939, and by the 50s, the freedom to read sort of commitment was firmly entrenched as a core professional value. However broadly it was and wasn't shared by the public, but it was a core professional value. The association also shifted its platform to emphasize the role of selection, that keyword, selection rather than censorship. The case for selection, and what selection means here is kind of the curation of materials by librarians, right? So you can't read everything. You might need some guidance. There is such a thing as standards. There's such a thing as limited time. So a librarian's job is to help curate your choices, ideally not control them. The case for selection was made in the 50s by Lester Asham in a Now Foundational article, and ever since, the ALA has been firmly committed to free, if guided reading. The organization has published multiple editions of its Intellectual Freedom Manual, which is still a real resource for teachers, librarians, other folks. And that is a compilation of resources put together by the ALA's Office for Intellectual Freedom. And probably the ALA's best-known anti-censorship program is Banned Books Week, which emerged out of a dramatic display of books in padlocked cages at the 1982 Booksellers Association convention. So the booksellers were also part of this free reading partnership. Now celebrated in libraries and bookstores. I love the idea of Banned Books Week being celebrated, right? Banned Books Week not only affirms sort of free reading, but also showcases, right? Showcases books that have been banned, which helps boost sales and generate publicity. And so this is the statement on the freedom to read, and it's easily discoverable online. And this is these are some of the posters for. This is the poster for the last or the upcoming, Banned Books Week, and then various graphics that shows how libraries and bookstores have created displays around the concept, and also there's whole manuals about how to do this. The Canadian Federation of Library Associations, which of course superseded the Canadian Library Association, has its own track record of commitment to intellectual freedom as well as to truth and reconciliation. The Federation's Intellectual Freedom Committee likewise keeps track, as does the ALA, of reported challenges and other matters impacting public access to books in Canadian institutions and contexts. And this is something, again, I suspect you know more about than I do. Professional, national, some international library associations, right, are among our most visible and effective advocates of free reading. And I think this part's crucial. They're not necessarily beholden to state and federal laws. It depends on the laws, but they're not necessarily regulated by the same things. Library groups and related organizations like PEN America have taken the lead in many ways in pushing back against censorship measures. Plus, keep in mind that censorship, while definitely a problem in terms of its restrictions, right, on circulation and access, it's part of the broader negotiation of literature and culture, and it has often unpredictable histories and effects. As scholars of obscenity, including these folks, emphasize, censorship actually often helps create literature, create value in its by assigning social value to controversial books, right? In the case of children's literature, many, many books, once denounced as inappropriate, as age inappropriate, and even revolting, have now essentially make up a canon of good, if not ideal, books for kids. And there's a lot of examples of this. The history of censorship of books for kids and teens is full of amusing, if also enraging, moments, from the banning of Tarzan of the Apes, because Tarzan lives in sin with Jane, to restrictions on Lewis Carroll's Alice books as insufficiently realistic in its depictions of animals. Sexuality is still controversial, of course, when it comes to children's books, as is really anything not heteronormative, basically. But even there, we've seen steady gains in representation across the years. Queer picture books started to appear in the early 1990s, despite the legacy of Reaganism. And books about HIV and AIDS likewise multiplied and gradually, if maybe too gradually sometimes, improved. The sort of push-pull of censorship and anti-censorship helped break new ground. The dynamics of censorship and anti-censorship work do often lead to long-term gains in representation and access. That doesn't mean we like censorship. It just means we don't always know how the censorship and the fight against it is going to work. Many censored books wind up elevated by the controversy and enjoy wider circulation as a result of their ostensible notoriety, often selling well to consumers. So book bans almost do work like a form of pricing. At the least, we can say, and I think this is, if you don't agree with any of that, I think we probably agree that to censor a book is not to suppress it necessarily, but to give it a place in public debate. And I think we've seen that how many more people know about Flamer who may not have heard about it prior to this latest round of controversy, for example. Really, most books have a very limited shelf life, right? Most books go out of print very fast. Really the best way to kill a book is not to censor it, but to ignore it, right? Just let it go quietly into the night. Even when books are restricted, they may remain important, and that's just a valuable thing right there. So it doesn't mean, that we need to see this as a good thing, but I think we maybe need to think a little more carefully about some of the complexities of it. Book banning definitely sucks, especially when kids can't get hold of the materials they need, but it also spotlights titles and raises kind of the public stakes, right, of writing and representation. And another cause for optimism is the literature itself. Progressive children's literature, and I mean literature that's kind of aligned to what we think of as progressive values and principles, has existed for a long time, even in more restrictive times. Books for and or about queer kids and teens have been on the upswing since the 90s, as I said, and there's certainly been backlash, but there's been progress and success, and that, again, is evidenced in the acceleration of book bans. It actually kind of affirms that queer representation is working. Some publishers, meanwhile, continue to step up and produce more diverse material by diverse authors. I'm going to talk about a few in a second. The current book bans and anti-DEI efforts may chill the enthusiasm, but I don't think it's going to ultimately halt the progress. So we'll see. That's maybe a little too utopian, but even Mortar has its queers, and I'm here to tell you now that there is a fun tradition of Florida queer literature for kids, material set in Florida with queer themes and commitments. And here are some examples of this. Florida Queer Lit for Kids includes both what we kind of describe as queer-coded, so not explicitly out material, and then kind of more explicitly, thematically gay affirmative, queer affirmative titles. And it includes both of these categories. And one of my favorite titles belongs to the queer-coded tradition, and this is Carol Riley Brink's delightful 1959 children's novel, The Pink Motel. As we all know, one of the big musical hits of the last few years is Chaperone's Pink Pony Club, which opens, and feel free to sing along. I know you wanted me to stay, but I can't ignore the crazy visions of me in LA. And I heard that there's a special place where boys and girls can all be queens every single day, and not just boys and girls, of course. That special place is the Pink Pony Club down in West Hollywood, but modeled on a different strip club, apparently, in Missouri. The song speaks of longing for a new magical life, and that's very much core to this book, The Pink Motel, which is also about the draw of a kind of a new life in a special place. And Brink is best known for her frontier story, Caddy Woodlawn, which won the Newbery Medal. The Pink Motel is hilariously queer-coded, written by an author at the top of her game, having a lot of fun with the story. It opens in Minnesota with the Mellon family learning that they have inherited a small motel in Florida from Mrs. Mellon's recently deceased great-grand-uncle, of course, Hiram Stonecrop. The Mellons have not seen the motel, which their cousin Rose pronounces a very peculiar place. Pressed to explain, Cousin Rose says, "It's pink. Not white or brown or gray like an ordinary motel. It's a real bright pink. A speaking pink, you might say." And, she continues, whether because of the color or because Uncle Hiram was a rather unusual person, it attracted the most unusual guests. This little tidbit alarms the mother in the story, Mrs. Mellon, who says, well, what do you mean by unusual? And she says, well, I don't know exactly, says Cousin Rose. There's nothing you can put your finger on. But I felt it as soon as I sat down in the place. The place was peculiar. The guests, they were very strange. Our protagonist, Kirby, and younger sister, Bitsy, are thrilled by this turn of events, especially Kirby. For some reason, we learn, and this is language from the book, he had always liked peculiar and unusual things. A pink motel and unusual guests, he thought that could be fun. The kids start packing for the trip, and then as they're packing for the trip, they discover some odd personal items in their closet. And this is the language from the text. Hanging at the back of Kirby's closet was a bright pink necktie, which Kirby could not remember having seen before. He took it out and tried it on. It was a very bright pink, and Kirby was pleased by his appearance. Meanwhile, Bitsy appeared wearing a bright pink hair ribbon. So, a little gender conformity here. Look what I found at the back of my closet, she says. Something about the pink necktie and pink hair ribbon made Kirby and Betsy feel very happy and gay, writes Brink. Kirby whistled as he packed, and Betsy sang. This all transpires in the first 5 pages of the book. As for the motel itself, it does not disappoint. It was pinker, this is language again from the novel, it was pinker than Kirby's necktie or Betsy's hair ribbon. It was pink, 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 capital letters. On the square of lawn in front of the motel were 2 life-size plaster flamingos, and they were pink too. And this is on page 6, by the way. The book gets queer from there. I'm not going to read any more from it, I promise, but including with the introduction of those strange guests that come to the motel every year, including in the queer witchy Miss Fairy, who's sort of reminiscent of Mary Poppins. There's a plot, sort of, involving pseudo-gangsters who try to steal a buried treasure. It's very Florida fare, and lots of buried treasure and pirate booty. But the book is mostly a showcase for queer characters in a queer setting. There's even a kind of Christmas ball, complete with dancing poodles. The novel itself is a speaking pink, you might say. It is pink, pink, pink. To call it queer-coded feels like an understatement. Brink plays on the ambiguities of Florida tourism and queer identity exactly at the same time that the Johns Committee is carrying out its repressive campaign. I'm going to take a quick sip. No shelf here, so I have to bend down here. Okay. So-called out or affirmative LGBTQ kidlit in Florida follows national trends emerging a little later in the 1990s in the form of YA novels. And just so you know, I only have a bit more to go before we'll be able to go to questions, but I'll talk a little bit more about the literature. The earliest kind of out novel, out titles rather, in Florida, so the kind of gay affirmative rather than the queer coded, right, tradition, are Lou Vickers' Breathing Underwater and P.E. Ryan's Saints of Augustine, both appearing in 2007. And these are rather different novels, but they are both gay coming out and kind of coming of age stories in which a Florida setting actually helps to stage or articulate a queer identity in different ways. Saints of Augustine is set, if you hadn't already guessed, in St. Augustine, Florida, which is the oldest continually occupied city in the United States. And the book follows the friendship of 2 teenage boys, one of whom is gay. And the St. Augustine setting adds sort of an interesting texture to the plot. Meanwhile, and I think this is a really interesting book, Vickers' Breathing Underwater is not, as it might sound, it's not a mermaid story, although we have those as well. But it's a novel about a girl who nearly drowns literally and symbolically due to her mother's homophobia and just general family dysfunction. And instead of drowning, the protagonist slowly learns to breathe underwater, as it were, to survive in a hostile environment. And what makes this novel so powerful is not only its open expression of queer desire and sexuality, although there's definitely that, but also it's linking a parental hostility to the dream called Florida. So there's a critique of the tourism. The family lives in Chattahoochee, Florida, which is a real place in the Panhandle, where the state hospital is located, and that's where the mother in the novel works. Protagonist really correctly links her mother's sort of bad parenting to the myth-making of Florida tourism, and that's these excerpts give you a little taste of that. Lily has to fend for herself, basically, and survive her mother's hatred. The author, by the way, knows a thing or two about Florida tourism. Lou Vickers, she's also published beautiful coffee table books about famous Florida attractions like Weeki Wachee, which is the city of mermaids, and Cypress Gardens, which is where water skiing was sort of popularized in the States, of all places. A series of recent queer YA titles set in Florida also have sort of watery settings and use water to explore alternative identities and states, and that's especially true in stories for girls. Florida, remember, is a liquid landscape, right? Not only around the edges, but it's in its interior too, home to a network of lakes, swamps, freshwater springs, rivers, streams. So examples of books about queer girl protagonists that are YA that are in this tradition include Maria Engrande Mora's Immeasurable Depth of View, which is also about sort of mental illness and neurodivergence, and Jenny Meyer's Sane's One Last Breath, which is actually a supernatural thriller, but has a queer friendship, queer love affair actually at the center. And another example, which is not about girls, but about 2 sensitive boys who are clearly in love with each other as well as with Florida nature, is this middle grade book called Manatee Summer, which unfortunately has already attracted some attention by censors who essentially read between the lines, because when you read the book, language such as this makes pretty clear there's strong emotion, there's strong feeling between the boys. There's no mention of sexuality, identity, but this language is there. Also in the queer-coded tradition is the fabulous Goldie Vance series, which began as comic books collected into graphic novels and then continued as paperback graphic novels and illustrated prose novels. So lots of different genres. Holding all of these formats together as it's evolved across the series of titles is the title character, Goldie Vance, who is a biracial 16-year-old hotel detective who also happens to be queer. Goldie lives with her black father in a tourist hotel in South Florida called the Cross Palms Resort, but she also spends time with her white mother who works as a mermaid. The Goldie Vance book picks up on many classic elements of Florida storytelling, including the beach hotel setting, the girl sleuth tradition, lots of girl detectives in this tradition. Love that. Goldie Vance is also a sort of retro-futuristic space story. It references Cape Canaveral and the Space Coast of Florida. Goldie is not only one of the few black characters in Florida children's and YA fiction, she's also the only, to my knowledge, the only black queer character to have materialized so far. And in Goldie Vance Volume 1, she develops a crush on another girl named Diane, who works in a local record shop, and they start to date. There's no discussion of identity, no coming out storyline for Goldie or any of the other characters. Goldie doesn't change much across the titles, which is not too unusual for sort of comics format. Sometimes depends a little. She remains roughly the same age, in keeping with some conventions, not just of graphic novels, but of series fiction, right? But if Goldie's queerness isn't remarked on verbally, the book visually emphasizes Goldie's desire for Diane. Color can be really important in graphics and in comics and graphic novels, and color indicates mood and feeling and intensity, right? And it's definitely the case in the Goldie Vance image text. The early volumes are suffused with gold and yellow tones, as if to kind of underscore Goldie's sunny disposition. Other colors come into the picture during important episodes and especially action scenes, and that includes pink. Panels showing the interactions of Goldie and Diane are almost always pink, even speaking pink. While Goldie doesn't discuss her sexuality, nobody says gay per se. The books beautifully accentuate such. So I will wind down with brief discussion of two more titles. Am I good on time still? Yeah, okay, you can just come get me with the hook if you need to. I will wind down with a brief discussion of two more Florida queer titles for kids, which what's nice about these two is they actively talk back to the ugly politics of the moment. And these two books are Romina Garber's YA fantasy Lobizona, was published in 2020, which challenges gender binarism and also anti-immigration policy at the national level. So it's really more a critique. It's set in Florida, but it's also a critique of federal policy. Whereas Brianna Schrum and Sarah Waxabaum's more conventionally realistic novel, Margot Zimmerman Gets the Girl, tackles recent Florida laws. An exemplary work of Latinx speculative fiction, Lobizona, the first of these final two texts, tells the story of Manuela, Manu Azul, who is an undocumented teenager of Argentine descent living in Miami with her mother. She doesn't know her father, and her mother will not disclose his identity for reasons of safety. Manu's mother is also undocumented, as are most of the residents of the building in which they live. Everybody there lives in fear of the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. They live in fear of ICE. Dedicated to, quote, all of our children caught in the crosshairs of nationalism, end quote, Lobizona opens with these lines. Some people are illegal. Lobizonas do not exist. Both of these statements are false. As the novel unfolds, Manu learns that the reason she suffers from crippling menstruation pains is because she's a wolf girl or a werewolf, the seventh consecutive daughter in the family, and she morphs during the cycle. According to legend, that should make her a bruja or witch, not a werewolf. Werewolves are supposed to be male and have superhuman strength and speed, while the witches have elemental powers and are able to manipulate water, earth, air, fire. Manu, however, is not only a magical creature, but one of a kind. The first, and so far only Lobizona, or female werewolf in her culture. And setting this discovery in motion is an ICE raid on her mother's workplace, which leads Manu to flee Miami. She accidentally kind of hitches a ride to a secret community of Brujas and Lobazones, which is also a magic school. So this is a kind of magic school variation deep in the Everglades. So it's a sort of Floridian version of Hogwarts. Garber, I think, likely chose that setting for her schooling community, not only because the Everglades can be magical, but also because, as many of you may know, Black and Indigenous Floridians used to kind of take refuge there, especially during the Seminole campaign, anti-Seminole campaign, the Seminole Wars, and other episodes of persecution. In any case, we learned that the magical species to which Manu now belongs, called Septimus, has its own elaborate caste system and social rules. So it's not an ideal society by any stretch. And Manu discovers that she is undocumented in that system too. She's double undocumented. And in fact, Septimus people all over the globe are required to carry paperwork, identification, to confirm their legal status, making Manu doubly illegal in the parallel cultures. And so her undocumented status is one of her two big challenges. The second is her singularity as a Lobazona, female werewolf. Septimus culture is rigidly gendered, but Manu explodes the gender binary just really through her existence. Her Lobazona status works as kind of allegory for trans and or non-binary identity. And the allegory doesn't stop there. In the Septimus world, which is suffering from declining population, gender policing goes hand in hand with the enforcement of heterosexuality and reproduction. Septimus can't marry people of the same sex, and anyone who refuses to have children can be arrested. With the 2022, remember this book was published in 2020, with the 2022 overturning of Roe versus Wade, of course, women in the United States can be forced to carry pregnancies to term, and in fact have already been forced to do that, and can be arrested for evading state laws. Lobazona ends with Manu and her friends on the run to Argentina, and that's where the sequel, which is called Cazadora, picks up, and that was published the next year in 2021. So Garber herself, the author, immigrated from Argentina as a child, and as she explains in an afterword, and this is her speaking, when I was 5 years old, my mom and dad uprooted my sister and me from our native Buenos Aires, Argentina, and moved our family to Miami, Florida. They left to escape an era of terrorism and dictatorship in Argentina that saw families torn apart. Hoping to raise us in the land of the free, our parents bought into the American dream, end quote. While she and her sister, Garber and her sister, struggled to learn English and to adapt to life in the United States, Garber notes that unlike her character, she was granted citizenship because her father had a working visa. And this is the author speaking again. I wrote this book because today's immigrants aren't so lucky. For the crime of coming into this country in search of a safer future, people are being arrested, traumatized, indefinitely detained, separated from their families, deported. Children are being caged, and that's in italics. She's calling out the first Trump administration, right? Not the current one. This was 2020. Published in 2024, right after Don't Say Gay, Margot Zimmerman Gets the Girl, which I think is one of my favorite books in recent reading, responds to the discouraging political scene in Florida, specifically with humor and passion. Margot Zimmerman is published by Inkard Press, which is a Canadian imprint of Harlequin, which is a publishing company best known for romance novels. Go Canada, though, right? Its characters are on the cusp of adulthood, planning their futures after high school while navigating the usual challenges of young love and desire. The novel focuses on the growing friendship and then romance between the title character, Margot Zimmerman, and the girl she gets, who is Abby Solokoff. At the book's start, Margot abruptly realizes that she's gay and seeks out Abby as her mentor in all things queer, as Abby is out at school and has a circle of queer friends. Impossibly high achieving, she's also student body president, homecoming queen, valedictorian, all at once. Margot is also neurodivergent. She decides she wants to learn everything she can about queer culture, and Abby plays along, and she even gives Margot a syllabus of reading and writing assignments. Margot concludes that anything could be queer culture, but nothing absolutely as such. While Abby tutors Margot, Margot in turn helps Abby study for AP History. And the two girls develop a playful and competitive dynamic. Margot Zimmerman gets the girls insightful, funny, well-written. It celebrates love and desire with no fear of censorship, narrating sex scenes as well as Abby's use of a vibrator. As they are getting to know each other, Margot thinks Abby, quote, has great dick energy. While Abby observes, this is what Abby says, rarely have I been so clearly, so unsubtly, so thoroughly eye-fucked by anyone like I am being right now by Margot Zimmerman. And if Margot has only recently realized her identity, queerness runs in her family, her older brother Mendel identifying as pan. So Schrum and Waxelbaum's novel is set in Ocala, which is a small community in north central Florida, about 30 miles from where I live, and it's known for its horse farms. And Margot wants to become a large animal veterinarian, but it's not just this setting that makes the novel feel like authentic Florida storytelling. It's also the book's engagement with recent Florida politics. When Abby gives Margot her syllabus and a list of queer books to read, Margot goes to the school library to see what she can find. Our school library, she explains to the reader, doesn't have a queer section at all, and she just declares this very flatly, as if it were a surprise. This is the Bible Belt. There's no way our governor, who doesn't even want us to say the word gay, would let any public school library have a whole labeled section of books for people like me. So I'm surprised that I can find any of the books on Abby's reading list. Then she continues, I get curious. I Google under the radar queer YA and spend some time poking through the shelves, finding a surprising number of titles that haven't yet been banned by PTA PAM and the Campus Crusade. Margot figures out that gay affirmation is disavowed, but also that queer-coded literature exists and sometimes flies under the censorship radar. Margot checks out everything she can find, winding up not only with unspecified YA titles, we don't actually know what books they are, but also queer classics by Audre Lorde and James Baldwin. Later, Margot reflects on what she's learning from Lorde's sister Outsider about intersectional identity and about the entanglements of racism and homophobia. Meanwhile, Abby muses on her bisexual identity, thinking that in a perfect world, she wouldn't have to worry about how others perceive her. But this isn't a perfect world, she reminds us. It's Florida. We can't even say gay here. Neither Schrum nor Waxelbaum lives in Florida, and Inkard Press, as I mentioned, is a Canadian outfit. I doubt very much, actually, that these two authors are worried about being banned in Florida. I suspect they anticipate it and might even welcome it. The book has a kind of ban this book feel to it. It's a sort of joyful provocation, really, and a kind of clapback. Schrum and Waxelbaum, the authors, likely aim for the broader book market while doing their part for queer visibility, precisely by folding book banning into the plot. It's really smart, and we need more of this kind of storytelling. So for those of you who are writers, please keep writing. Literature matters. And to all of us, we obviously need to support our libraries and our librarians who do so much to support us. So given how grim things are in the United States, it might seem especially perverse to recommend cautious optimism. But I do see some reasons for it, including these developments. Not to mention just our ethical imperative, right? Not to give up. Representation matters. Persistence matters, right? Queerness matters. And for those of you who have been following the Rainbow Crosswalks sort of situation, this is the one outside of the Pulse nightclub that was de-rainbowed. It's now been re-rainbowed, I think 5 times. First by colored chalk, then by paint, and now they've actually stationed, not just in Orlando, but in other places, the state has stationed police officers to watch these crosswalks, which is an excellent use of taxpayer money, and across the state. So the battle continues. We may lose some of the battles. Hopefully we'll win the war. I hate to use military metaphors, but in any case, I think there's a lot of reason to be cautiously optimistic. So thank you very much.
Thanks for that lovely talk. Kenneth did last night promise memes, and I'm so thrilled that the memes came through. So we're going to have time for questions if people have them. Before we have a reception to follow. I don't want to start out with kind of a sad question, but and you said you weren't specifically an expert on book banning, but we're often, we know definitely there are all kinds of harms to children by banning these books. We know there's all kinds of bullying and harm to queer kids in the school system. Does anybody ever cite actual real harms that have occurred as a result of these books being in a library? Has some child been traumatized by a graphic novel? Is anything ever cited as an actual harm? And what might that tell us about what's really going on with these book bans?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say the research does not. There is no research. Yes, it's a complete myth, and the actual children in the United States are undervalued. That's to put it generously, right? And the U.S. still hasn't signed the International Rights on the Child Convention, and there is a complete resistance to any actual acknowledgement of material realities, the impacts of violence, of poverty. And these are just, it is the endless recycling of this idea. A lot of it is again, this idea that childhood is de facto devoid of sexuality. And at the same time, weirdly, it's presumed to be straight, right? So those two things are true at the same time. And anything that seems to contradict this is actually met with violence. I would say the violence is on the side of the censors. So. Yeah, so thanks. Should I just stay up here? Or?
Yeah, you stay right there.
I will.
You stay right there. Are there questions up here? We've got a couple of people with mics. Over here or no? Nancy, up this way.
Thanks. That was a fantastic talk. Thanks so much for your work. And there was a book a while ago that you said they're kind of starting to read between the lines, right? Because right now, the censorship is on what is explicitly sexual. I'm not being optimistic here. I love your optimism at the end because we fight this, but we need to be prepared for what's coming next.
Yeah.
And do you see in your work evidence of, 1984 is on this list right here. And do you see evidence of the reading between the lines coming next as in this movement?
Yeah, thank you for that really excellent question. It worries me, actually, anytime I decide I want to champion. So, it's one thing to talk about The Pink Motel, which was published so many years ago, is not in print anymore. I'm not going to do any damage to her career or to the books. In fact, it might be reissued if there's controversy. But I spoke with Evan Griffin, who's the author of Humanities Summer, and I had an interview with him when I was working on this project that is still being theoretically finished on Florida Children's Lit. And I asked him about that, and he was this last year disinvited he had been invited to go back to Texas to speak. He's from Texas. He got invited to go back to speak on the book, and someone got a hold of somebody like me, probably, saying this book is queer-coded or this book is a beautiful. I think really what it was even just people reading between the lines that this book is a beautiful depiction of friendship between boys. Gay, 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 gay. And it's so frustrating because on the one hand, that's not necessarily true, right? At the same time, there is I think some broader awareness now that there is a range of strategies that writers use, and then most of the time when I write about topics, I know that about 5 people are going to read what I write. Derek, because I pay him to read it, and maybe my mother. But I don't worry a lot about if I call attention to some of these titles, am I doing damage by letting people know? Well, I think it's in my mind for sure. I know I appreciate no, you're not, but I think it's a really smart question because I do think there's starting to be some awareness of that, and I don't know and even this author was, I think, kind of hesitant to talk to me about it, and so I didn't write about it. I asked if I could speak about it. He said yes, but I said didn't want it in writing, and so I think that is the reality, and it's just so interesting because in the early part of the 20th century, there were so many books that took on a wide range of what we think of now as progressive, if not radical, topics for kids, including a lot of anti-capitalist sentiment and things, and they kind of just flew under the radar, as a number of scholars have shown, because people didn't know how to read them, and they were not thinking in those terms exactly. And so I don't know. It's an ethical question as well as a really interesting theoretical and practical question, isn't it? Yeah. I wish I had a better answer, but I think that's going to be the tension. It's been, I think, I don't know. There may be some real disadvantages to broadening the range. So thank you. Welcome
over
other
here.
thoughts on that too, because these are open questions, right?
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. Things are pretty grim here in Alberta, especially if you work in a school or a school library. And I'm wondering if you can inspire us with any stories from librarians in schools in Florida that have done anything really cool, really professionally non-compliant to stand up to these laws.
Yes, thank you. I think we do need to do a better job of documenting those. There are some stories along those lines, and some people have actually been fired because they spoke out, and and in some cases there were, people sort of closer to the end of their careers thought, this risk is worth it to me, and I'm going to be public about this. And like one of the quotations from the teacher that was interviewed, there were several teachers that were interviewed about the removal of all the books from the classrooms, who went right on public record and said, this is outrageous, you're depriving people of a wide range of materials, this is, it's not right, it's not ethical, it's not good for education, it is a form of violence, rather than preventing violence. So it's been teachers and librarians who have kind of set the standard in many ways. I have to say I can't think of a particular example, and I think that's a problem, obviously, right? I think it has had a lot of chilling effects as well, and one of the things I learned was that quite a few of the private schools just opted to kind of follow in line with some of these censorship practices, even though they were not bound to do that, right? But they did, because they were often in the same communities, they were often worried about losing financial support, they were worried about reprisal. So that's a little discouraging. There was a private school that was told that their unit on neoclassical art was inappropriate, statue of David, and so David was censored in the curriculum, in an art curriculum, and it was a private school, and they were absolutely not obliged to do anything in response to that concern, but they did. They removed the unit from the curriculum, and then it generated all kinds of bad publicity for the school. So maybe that's actually good. But thank you. I'll keep looking and collecting. If you have any, would you send them my way too? That would be much appreciated.
We do need more stories of brave resistance.
Yes. we need encouragement.
Other questions? Oh, is there somebody down here? Oh, yes.
Again, I want to express my gratitude for how wonderful this presentation has all been. You did a wonderful job. Thank you so much. As we all know, kids, teenagers, young adolescents who are going into college and university, more curious than ever. You can never dull it. You can never silence it. One thing for that is, I know, especially for myself when I was younger, when I was quieted and told, don't do those things, that's not allowed, especially in small town Alberta, you seek other outlets, specifically the internet.
Yeah, exactly.
And especially on university and college campuses, a lot of times that's when kids are away from those restrictions for like the first time. Have you seen any movements really kind of be bolstered up, or any, students forming more organizations based around queerness than before?
Thank you, first of all, for that kind comment, and also it's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. I don't talk about the internet and the online sort of. There's a whole rich layer of things there. I think often the fan fiction and fandom, and the many communities that participate and publish there, and that's so interesting. And there's a real source of resistance and creativity and engagement there. In my campus. Really one of the oldest and most successful student organizations is the Pride Student Union. I'm the faculty advisor, and they have not stopped the programming in the face of every single one of these kinds of obstacles, and recently lost some school funding, and so but because there are alums, they have a network of alums. We got private funding, and we're able to do the events, the welcome ball, and several other events that they've planned for years. But yeah, I think you're right. I think there is real space for expansion there. We are, at Florida, we are really under scrutiny in terms of not just this issue, but the full spectrum of micromanaging of content in the humanities. So, and it's a real series of struggles right now. So for example, I was certifying our curriculum. I was supposed to certify that every course offered sufficient engagement with Western civilization. That was the actual language from the state statute. So I, of course, just said, check, yes, check, check. English language, check, yeah, it's film, it's a book, yeah, check, 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 you know. But it's just, you know, I mean, that kind of reality. But yeah, I think there is a lot of activism. You know, it's frustrating though, because there's also clearly infantilization of college-age students, right, and especially student activists. I mean, that's been very, very prominent. And Florida is again a place where there's been a lot of crackdown on student campus activism across a range of issues, but certainly on the issue of the violence and on Palestinians. And so I think that's been a reality too. But the activism continues, and people are still pretty vocal. And there are some of the legal student organizations are very, very active. Yeah, thank you.
And the mention of alums stepping up, I think, is also really important, because we can't just leave it to the people who are targeted to defend themselves and to fight back on behalf of all of us. Everybody has to step up. Everybody has to look to support a librarian, a teacher, a student organization, something like that. It's a collective responsibility for collective freedoms.
And at least, you know, in the case of a lot of state universities, I'm not quite sure how it works here, but so much of the funding now is actually not state funding. We've lost so much state funding for a lot of programs and initiatives. So I've been really trying to cultivate the development folks, and even though you have to go through the university and they want more, they may not have the same goals that I have in cultivating those alums, but in the case of the Pride Student Union, there is a really nice network of alums because it's been active now for like 30 or 40 years. And they have donated very generously and and also just been moral support. That's as important as the money, right? Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, I think we've actually come to the end of our Q&A time, because I want to leave time for reception where people can actually, if you haven't had a chance to ask Kenneth a question, you could talk to him in a more informal way about perhaps other reading tips as well, like the Pink Motel, which I'm going to go home and try to find right now, and maybe
I should want a pink necktie.
Maybe
I don't know what I was thinking.
Exactly, you need a pink necktie. But before I invite you to stick around and do please talk to the people from Shelf Life Books, buy some of the pornographic literature that they brought, or the books by Darrett and Kenneth, and thank them for the role they're doing, frankly, in helping to protect the right to read. Thanks to the library, of course, for supporting events like this and for, again, supporting our right to read. But then just quickly, I want to say thanks to the many people that helped to make this particular event possible. The people from Alumni and Ben Fleury, the people here at the library and Ian McBurney, Callie Wilkinson, the coordinator of the CIH. Thanks so much to Darrett for stepping up and giving that lovely introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming, but let's give one last thanks to Dr. Kenneth Kidd for that wonderful talk.
If any of you want to adopt a Floridian, just let me know. Thank you very much. It's really been great to be here. I appreciate everything.